Hello, this is Hide. Welcome to another episode. So, this is your history preparation class where we break down the syllabus so it's clear, structured, and easy to follow. Okay, so today we're going to discuss chapter 1, okay, 1.1, latar belakang negara bangsa sebelum kedatangan Barat. So, before the West arrived, we already had a system. Okay, so let's get one thing straight. The idea that civilization, um, structure, or even the concept of a nation only came with Western colonization, that's simply not true. Because, long before the West stepped into the Malay archipelago, they were already powerful, organized kingdoms. We're talking about places like Funan, Champa, Srivijaya, Kedatua, Ganga Negara, what else? Angkor and Majapahit. These were not chaotic societies. They had systems. They had order, and they had identity. At the center, okay, so now let's talk about the ciri-ciri negara bangsa kerajaan alam Melayu, okay, the characteristic of negara bangsa kerajaan alam Melayu. At the center of all this was the king, okay? The king. Now, the king wasn't just a political leader, he was the symbol of the entire systems. Okay, in some kingdoms like Champa, the king was even associated with divine power. And that matters because when people believe their ruler is sacred, loyalty is not optional. It becomes part of the culture. But here's the thing: no king rules alone. Okay, so behind every ruler, there was a structure, nobles, administrators, people who made sure the kingdom actually functioned day to day. This wasn't random leadership, it was organized governance. And then there's law, okay, undang-undang, because without law, power means nothing. Okay, so these kingdoms had clear legal system, to maintain order, to maintain stability. We take a look at Majapahit, for example. They used Kutara Manawa laws, that tells us something important. You know, they weren't just ruling; they were governing with intention. Now, okay, that's undang-undang. Now let's talk about wilayah pengaruh. Okay, sphere of influence. Okay, when we talk about wilayah pengaruh or sphere of influence, we talk about control. Okay, territory method. Okay, a kingdom wasn't just defined by a place or a throne, it was defined by influence. Okay, areas where people recognize the authority of the ruler. Let's take a look at Funan, for example. Uh, Funan, for instance, controlled a massive region, right, stretching across key parts of Southeast Asia. That's not small scale leadership, that's regional power, right? And then the people, okay, the people, this is where it gets interesting. Okay, right, yet loyalty wasn't just expected, it was proven. In Srivijaya, people took oaths, I mean real ceremonies, even drinking sacred water to show allegiance. And that's not symbolic fluff, that's a system reinforcing authority through belief and ritual. So when you put all this together, the king, the laws, the territory, the people, what do you get? Okay, you get a functioning nation state. Not a modern one, not with borders and passports, but a clear structure of power, um, identity, and governance. And here's the key takeaway. Okay, the Malacca Sultanate didn't build something from nothing. It inherited this entire framework, they refine it and later they strengthen it with Islamic principles. So next time someone suggests that order only came with colonization, you already know the answer. Now let's go to still chapter one. Let's discuss 1.2, ciri-ciri negara bangsa Kesultanan Melayu Melaka. We still talk about the characteristic of negara bangsa, but this time we focus on Kesultanan Melayu Melaka. So, Malacca Sultanate, right? When people hear Malacca Sultanate, many often imagine something simple, a king, a palace, maybe some trade happening at the port. But that picture is incomplete because what we are looking at is a fully functioning nation state. Okay, so let's break it down. So let's break, first power. Okay, in Malacca, power was clear. The ruler, later known as the Sultan, held the highest authority, right? We had that. And then after the arrival of Islam, that title carried even more weight, not just political leadership, but religious legitimacy. And here's the key point. He didn't rule alone. Malacca had structure, real structure, through the fourfold chief system, right? So we have this system pentadbiran. I mean, power was distributed among high-ranking officials, so this wasn't chaos. This was organized governance. It's one of the reasons Malacca didn't just survive, it expanded. Okay, now let's talk about the people, the rakyat. The citizen of Malacca, the Malays, the orang laut weren't passive. They were part of a system built on loyalty and obedience. They followed the laws. They recognized the Sultan's authority. And in return, they were protected. And this is important because what we are seeing here is not a blind obedience, it's a social contract. Okay, a mutual understanding between ruler and ruled. Next, we have sovereignty, kedaulatan. Okay, Malacca wasn't just calling itself powerful, it was recognized as powerful. Okay, the Ming Dynasty acknowledged it, diplomatic missions were sent, relations were built, and that's not symbolic, that's international recognition. Then comes the law. Okay, and this is where things get serious. Malacca had written legal systems, not one, but two. Okay, Hukum Kanun Melaka and Undang-Undang Laut Melaka. These weren't these were not just decorative documents. They regulated behavior, they enforced justice and kept order in both land and sea activities. And if you think this was a small kingdom, think again. Malacca controlled a wide territory, right, covering the Malay Peninsula and parts of Sumatra. Some areas were conquered, others aligned through diplomacy and also marriage. But either way, they acknowledge Malacca's authority. Finally, lambang kebesaran, okay, symbolism. So in Malacca, that came through royal customs, colors, noble music, regalia, and royal seal. The seal especially wasn't just ceremonial; it made decision official. It turned words into law. Okay, so when we talk about the Malacca Sultanate, we're not talking about a basic kingdom. We're talking about a system, a structured, recognized, and a disciplined nation state. And if we're being real, that's what made it powerful. Now let's go to 1.3, keunggulan sistem pentadbiran dan undang-undang. We talk about governance, we talk about law, okay, the system that made Malacca powerful. So let's get something straight. When people talk about the Malacca Sultanate, okay, they love to highlight trade, right? The busy port, the international ships, the wealth. Well, that's true, the trade. No denying about it. But that's not the full story. Okay, the full story is this. Malacca didn't become powerful because of trade. Trade came because Malacca was already powerful. You understand? And that power, it came from something far less glamorous, but far more important. A system that worked. Now, the word excellence gets thrown around a lot, right? But in this context, it actually means something very specific. It means a kingdom that is structured, disciplined, and hard to break. And Malacca, it checked every box. So let's start with the backbone of it all, okay? The four-fold chief system, this pembesar empat lipatan, okay? This wasn't random delegation, right? This was strategy. And at the top, you had Bendahara, okay? Think of him as the prime minister, but with military authority. And below, you had specialists, finance, security, maritime control. Each role was clear, each responsibility was defined. No overlap, no confusion. So that's how you run a government. And here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't a dictatorship in the chaotic sense. The Sultan, okay, didn't just rule and hope for the best. There was understanding, there was coordination, and of course, trust. The Sultan gave power, the officials delivered results. That balance, right? That's what kept the system stable. Now, let's talk about money because every strong government needs one thing, a reliable source of income. And Malacca had it, okay? Malacca had trade, taxes, tribute from territories, multiple streams, consistent flows. And again, this wasn't luck, okay? This was design. And we talk about security, tight, okay? Very, very tight. Okay, land and sea will both control, which matters because when you are the center of global trade, chaos is not an option. Okay, but here's the real backbone. The part that most people overlook. The law. Okay, I mean, people maybe don't overlook it, maybe, but just they don't really discuss it. Okay, Malacca had two major legal codes, the Malacca laws and the maritime laws. Okay, Hukum Kanun Malacca dan Undang-Undang Laut Malacca. And these weren't symbolic. They were enforced strictly. Okay, you commit murder without authority, death penalty. You defy the Sultan, death penalty. You forge royal orders, death penalty. No gray area. Now that might sound harsh, but here's the thing. It worked because when the consequences were clear, people think twice. And the law didn't just focus on punishment, it covered family matters, right? It covered family matters, trade ethics, governance, regulated behavior across society, even business. Even business had rules, right? No exploitation, no unethical transactions. You had to be of sound mind. You had to act responsibly. That's not just law enforcement. That's system building. And then we moved to the sea because Malacca was at its core a maritime power. On a ship, the captain, Nahoda, wasn't just a leader, he was the authority, right? The final voice, but not a tyrant, okay? Because major decisions were discussed, rules were clearly defined, and as the navigator at the time needed real knowledge, not guesswork, right? Waves, currents, star. This was science before we call it science, okay? And yes, even at sea, there were laws, okay? Crimes were punished, taxes were structured. Nothing was left to chance. So when we step back and look at the bigger picture, here's what we see. Malacca didn't rise because it was lucky. It rose because it was organized, okay? Because it understood something many systems today still struggle with, okay? Power without structure collapses. Okay, but power with structures, that becomes an empire. Okay, now let's go to 1.4, peranan pemerintah dan rakyat. Okay, roles of rulers and the people. Okay, let's talk about power. Okay, not the kind we see today with elections, headlines or social media outrage. I'm talking about power in the time of Malacca Sultanate, okay, where everything revolved around one central idea: trust. There was no written constitution like um, we have today. I mean, they had the law and everything. What I mean is that trust, a written trust. I mean, there's no public criticism or, no parliament debates. Instead, there was something called wadat, okay, an unwritten agreement between ruler and the people. And here's the interesting part, okay, it went both ways. The ruler couldn't simply do whatever uh, he wanted, right? And the people, they couldn't just rise up and rebel. Because when you break that balance, the entire system collapses. Okay, now society at the time was clearly divided, right? On one side, you had the ruling class, the sultan, the nobles, the royal family, okay, religious scholars. Okay, on the other side, the people, okay, ordinary citizens living under their authority. But this wasn't just a top-down system; it was structured, almost like a contract, even if no one ever wrote it down. Okay, so let's talk about the Sultan. Okay, the Sultan, as the highest authority, had responsibilities, real ones. Okay, he had to protect his people. Okay, maintain unity, ensure the kingdom remained stable and prosperous, and importantly, and he had to enforce laws that kept society in order. Okay, this wasn't optional. This wasn't expected. Then you have the nobles. Okay, think of them as the system behind the throne. They manage region, they maintain peace, acted as intermediaries, between ruler and the people. They collected resources, organized manpower. They even prepared for war when needed. So without them, the system doesn't function. And then the people. Now, this is where it gets interesting, okay? Because their primary role is loyalty, okay? Not casual loyalty, but absolute. They obeyed orders. Okay, they followed rules. And most importantly, they believed that disobedience had consequences beyond just punishment. Okay, they believe in tulah, tulah. I mean, a kind of divine consequence, not just legal punishment, but something bigger, something almost spiritual. You don't just break the rules, you invite disaster into your life. So naturally, rebellion wasn't just dangerous, it was unthinkable. But the people weren't passive either. They contributed. Okay, they served as soldiers. They joined communal efforts. They built infrastructure. They rode warship if needed. Okay, they were part of the system. Okay, when you step back and look at the whole picture, what you see is not just a monarchy. You see a system built on mutual dependence. Okay, like the ruler protects, the people support, and the nobles connect the two. Okay, simple but powerful. Okay, and maybe that's the real takeaway here. Stability doesn't come from force alone. It comes from a shared belief in the system. Okay, a system where everyone knows their role, and more importantly, accepts it. All right, that's all from me today. Thank you. See you in the next session.